There's a long-running art historical debate between disegno versus colore. Leonardo asked, which is of greater importance, form or color? That form should abound in beautiful colors or display high relief. He concluded that colors honor only those who manufacture them. A subject can be dressed in ugly colors and still astound those who contemplate it because of the illusion of relief. The implication was that the depth and form provided by luminance edges gives more meaning, expression, and emotion than that provided by colors. In contrast, Titian uses both color and form to portray the material richness of silk. In the 1600s to 1700s, this debate continued to rage in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where drawing, line, and form were emphasized over color. Poussin being the champion of drawing and form, Rubens of color. The Rubenists eventually won out, but the argument arose again in the 18th, 19th century when the French academicians argued that color was too base, too sensual, and too mutable. Critically, that color was not a reliable signal, it was too changeable. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, that idea. Ingres said, a noble contour may atone for other deficiencies supplied by the color. Delacroix retorted, he has not the slightest inkling that basically everything in nature is reflection and color. And you can see that Delacroix's beautiful use of color here. Painters who wanted to learn about color in painting had to go outside the école to private ateliers, which Delacroix did. So this debate between disegno and colore, I believe, is reflected in the world of vision science between the functions of luminance and color, I think about which Carl spoke in his opening lecture yesterday. And the theme of this conference is about what color does for us, why we like color, why do we like specific colors, and where and how in the brain do colors do all of this. So I don't really need to persuade you of the importance of color, but I do want to just summarize a few things which I think are themes of this conference and which the 18th century French Academy took some time to acknowledge. So color in real life does in fact do many things for us, visually, emotionally, and cognitively. It helps us find objects, it helps us understand what they are, it helps us categorize objects, memorize them, classify them, and then communicate about those objects to other people. It's also deeply embedded in our emotions and in our biological behaviors, particularly social sexual signaling. So just a few examples of those. Color helps to segment the image into material and illumination. So color in search helps us to find red T's amongst blue T's. It helps us to find our car in the car park. It helps us to find that blue book on our shelf very rapidly. It also helps to segment images into material and illumination. It distinguishes shadows from stains, specular highlights from flecks of paint. In segmenting an image, it helps us to disentangle illumination boundaries from material boundaries. So in this image of a fruit market, we have both shadow and bright sunlight. The luminance image captures all of these luminance boundaries, but the chromatic image in the chrominance channel alone shows the objects only. This idea of using luminance boundaries to find illumination and to use color boundaries to find objects is embedded in many machine vision algorithms for image segmentation. And long ago, Tommy Poggio and I, when I was doing my PhD, used this idea to look for areas of constant hue to find constant objects. And this idea has been playing out in machine vision much more sophisticatedly in later algorithms. I think also that, interestingly, the evolution of Turner as a painter illustrates this distinction between luminance and color. So one may argue that he transformed from a painter obsessed with light and shade, as you see here in this mezzotint of Norham Castle, when he was transmogrifying from being the son of a hardworking barber from a very troubled family into this wealthy, famous, revered artist. As he evolved, his use of color became freer and more abstract. He continued to return to various sites that he loved, including Norham Castle, which is in Northumberland, where I live now, painting it in different ways each time. Here, moving to a more expressive use of color in this watercolor of the same site, and here a much later painting where there's almost no luminance at all, just color, a sort of unearthly color. And I think, he found emotional harmonies and conflicts in dimensions that lightness simply cannot reach. I think he turned to color to express emotion, not to express a purer form of reality. So color does not only segment the image into objects, enables us to recognize what objects are and what material they're made from. It enables us to recognize the ripe bananas in this bunch, which is unripe, ripe, and overripe. It also enables us to recognize which particular mug is my mug, the red one or the blue one. So it tells us about material properties, but it also reaches into the emotions, as I showed with Turner, and forms the basis for much of our social and sexual communication. In fact, Carl Jung said that colors are the mother tongue of the subconscious, and they do seem to have a direct route to the emotions, and I think that's been talked about a lot today, but why they should have such emotional heft is still a matter of scientific debate. I think we vision scientists think of color as a biological signal. So it signals the edibility of fruit or the toxicity of a toadstool. It signals the healthiness of skin or the viability of a mate. And it's quite clear which one of these, if you're this way persuaded, mates you would prefer on the basis of skin color alone. The redness of the skin, or maybe Andrew disagrees, the redness of the skin being a signal to health and attractiveness is something that's well known and has been much studied by David Parrott, from whom the images of the sickly chap were taken, but again, known by portrait painters for millennia. Frans Hals simply dabbed a little bit of rouge on this lady's face to make her look more attractive. So color is not only used in the natural world, or the meaning of color arises not only from the use from the way that color naturally occurs, but also from its meaning applied to man-made objects in the artificial world. And here it can carry great danger. So in social signaling, color can convey belongingness to a particular gang, as it did in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, where hundreds of lives were lost a year in this gang warfare. And the Crips wore blue and the Bloods wore red. And as one of the activists there says, you had to be really wary, I mean really careful about what color you wore when you were in the neighborhood. Shoestrings, belts, anything. You could literally lose your life for wearing the wrong color in the wrong place. And he says he literally found one of his friends sliced in half by an AK-47 lying in a phone booth for wearing a red kerchief in a blue neighborhood. Anyway, so we color scientists think of color as acquiring its meaning from these natural sources, and we then use color to create new labels for meaningful groups and objects. Art historians and conservation scientists may take a slightly different tack on the meaning of color. In paintings, colors can serve both as a symbol for good or bad, heaven or hell, but in painting, color can also acquire another meaning on another level entirely, simply from the pigment itself. So for example, in Sasso Ferrato's The Virgin in Prayer, it's all about the expanse of this incredibly expensive pigment from lapis lazuli, ultramarine. This is a color you don't normally see in natural objects. And when we thrill to its brilliant blue now, we can ask, is it an emotion, in fact, that we've learned from the pigment? The blue has come to mean purity, heavenliness, all of these difficult spiritual things to attain, partly because of the very difficulty involved in attaining it from its terrestrial origins, and the fact that it's very, very expensive pigment. Similarly, you can say that Turner's love of blue might have had a mercenary quality to it. As a boy, he said he used to love to lie on his back and look at the clouds watching the sky. Then he would go home and paint the clouds, and then he would go to the market stall and sell the paintings. So blue became something that he could translate almost directly into money. I think blue is, in fact, very special, and most people, not just Turner, have a deeply embedded response to blue, which I'll come back to later. But so, color is all these things, but I should stress, and it's been stressed repeatedly through this conference, that color it's not just a physical thing, it's a perceptual process. It's something that's constructed in individual brains, and therefore it's a personal possession of each individual, subjective, not objective. And the way we see colors does depend on the light, surfaces, eye, and brain. And what I want to talk about is that dependence of color on the light and on the fundamental mechanisms in the brain, and sort of inter alia how these relate to how we see paintings. So we explored some of these ideas in an exhibition in the National Gallery 2 summers ago. The main exhibition was a collaboration between the curators and the science department at the National Gallery. It focused on the making of color from the physical stuff, such as the dried skin of the cochineal beetle, which makes carmine, minerals such as azurite, which makes the pigment of the same name, or lapis lazuli, which I've mentioned already, which makes ultramarine, which is the most expensive of all blue pigments. So it's really remarkable that in this particular painting by Gentileschi, the painting is actually painted on a small piece of lapis lazuli, which makes it extremely expensive and sort of dismissive of that expense by covering over almost half the surface with paint. The exhibition also looked at the fact that pigments change over time. So in this case, the bowl is painted with smalt, which was actually a brilliant cobalt blue when first applied, but has discolored rapidly to gray in this painting by Trek. The rooms in the exhibition were organized by color so that people walked through the exhibition around the hue circle, as it were. And one of the main concerns with the National Gallery's scientific department is with the color change that's caused in paintings by physical changes in the pigments over time, discoloration of varnishes, and also that damage caused by toxic wavelengths of light. So here we see a multitude of effects of the change in color of this painting, and you see a little bit of a cleaned area here where the varnish has been removed, which radically alters its color appearance. So the other concern in museums, of course, is which illumination is best to display paintings. What's the optimal illumination for paintings in galleries? So the National Gallery and other museums have to consider minimal light toxicity, energy efficiency, as well as visual appearance and viewers' moods. And the National Gallery has been, in some ways, a leader in introducing novel light sources into the gallery. For a long time, the trustees didn't want to put artificial light in. They didn't do so until 1934. But since then, there's been rapid changes in the lighting of paintings in the gallery. So that in some of the rooms, there's a combination of daylight and tungsten light, which mixes differing amounts of blue and yellow light, depending on the overall levels of daylight. And recently, LED lighting has been introduced in some of the rooms, which has revealed something that is also being found in scientific experiments of the preferred illumination color temperature for artwork. So in a sort of separate line of research by color and lighting scientists, different types of illumination have been investigated in terms of their properties, such as visibility, color, and other properties, including differences like their moistness or dryness, liveliness, and boringness. And in these studies, the optimal lighting color temperature in some studies has been found to be quite warm, 3,500, but in other studies, using a wider range of illumination temperatures, the optimal lighting temperature has been found to be 5,500 Kelvin, which is very close to neutral daylight. So what seems to be happening is that people's preferred illumination is slowly moving towards the blue. And the LED lighting chosen for the gallery reflects this change in people's preference. So in addition to these physical causes of the variability of color in painting, the National Gallery show Making Color, which I want to talk about mainly here, emphasized the perceptual causes of variability. So the final room in this circling through the hues was a cinema in which we tried to divert the thoughts of the audience away from the physical stuff from which paintings are constructed to the perceptual processes that happen in the brain. And specifically, we explored the phenomenon of color constancy and other principles of the construction of color by the brain. And in the room, we had 2 paintings on a back wall and video screens playing a very short film about color perception. And I have to say, and this was a really novel departure for the National Gallery, which has never had a sort of scientific exhibition as part of its main exhibition. And I won't play you the whole thing, but you just have to listen. We had to simplify the explanation of color.
There are 3 different cone tops, red, green, and blue. Each one is stimulated by different wavelengths of light. The cones reduce a full visible spectrum to 3 values at each location on the retina. After more processing, the cone signals are sent by the optic nerve to the brain, where the colours we see are finally created.
So that's sort of all of color perception in 1 minute, which was the challenge. So do forgive me for the simplicity. But the reason why I played that is because it's the voice, for those of you who are Doctor Who fans, is of Lalla Ward, who was one of the original Doctor Who companions. And she very kindly narrated the film for us. So one of the important points that we wanted to illustrate in the film and the demonstrations that the audience participated in was color constancy. You've heard a lot about color constancy, and Bevel Conway did say last night that if he saw another picture of a fruit bowl under different illuminations, he would be sick, but he's not here, so it's okay. I can show you this still life by van Holsdonk, 17th century Dutch painter, to remind you about the phenomenon of color constancy. So here we see the painting illuminated by bluish light, yet we still clearly see a bowl of yellow lemons. Although we might prefer the painting under this white light, we still see the lemons as yellow. And the fact that we see the lemons as yellow under both lights is an illustration of the phenomenon of color constancy, because of course, the light reflected from the lemon in the blue painting is radically different from that. It reflects when seen under white light, and yet we still perceive it as a lemon. Out of context, we might even call it a lime. These images were taken from a wonderful book by Roy Burns, which I can recommend to you. So color constancy is the constancy of object color under a change in illumination, specifically a change in the spectral power distribution of the illumination. And it's important to know that in the strictest sense, color constancy would mean that we would be completely insensitive to illumination changes, because objects would appear to stay the same color and we would be unaware of any change in the scene. And yet, we know that we have a phenomenal experience of light color and of changes in light color. And we also have non-visual responses to changes in light color and brightness. And painters also make this distinction. Some emphasize object color over the color of light. That's another dichotomy in the use of color in paintings, as in this painting from the 15th century. And this later painting by Moroni, I think, is all about the object. It's all about the dress, not about the color of light. A flat gray wall in the back removes all information about the light source, despite the shading and highlights on the dress. And yet other painters have specifically focused on the qualities of light, their color, their brightness, and their effects on the scene. For example, this painting by Jan Both really is capturing the changes in illumination spectrum across a scene with the sun coming up over the hill. Of course, the master at capturing the color of light was Monet with his series paintings, which are really all about the light. He takes a single scene and paints it under different illuminations, exaggerating the changes in the light color. Especially in his Rouen Cathedral series, he captures the change in light from cool, blue, foggy morning to brilliant sunlight. And he's effectively switching off color constancy to do so. In the contemporary world, we're bathed in spectacular light effects, both in nature, as we see here, and in the man-made world. And some of these light effects are really designed to make us feel a certain way, or to make objects look a particular way. So in this restaurant in London, the blue light is designed to arouse people and wake them up in the evening and keep them in the restaurant longer, whereas the light shining on this meat counter is designed to make the meat look redder and therefore more desirable. This warm white light here by Philips is designed to bring out the properties of color. What we can ask, though, is how does color constancy work? And there are multiple mechanisms for color constancy, which, of course, Carl touched on yesterday. Some of the most basic ones are chromatic adaptation in the retina, all the way up to higher level mechanisms such as memory color. Our knowledge of what objects are can influence our color of them, as Maria O'Connell showed so nicely yesterday. But I just want to show you one of the demonstrations that we included in the National Gallery exhibition as a way of showing you the combined effects of chromatic adaptation and memory color. So what is memory color? Memory color is that thing which we carry in our brains which enables us to recognize this apple as being unusual. It has a color which does not match our memory color of apples, whereas this strawberry is a naturally strawberry-colored strawberry, and the apple here is a red apple. So I want to illustrate the combined effects of chromatic adaptation and memory color through an image of Dunstanburgh Castle, which was another site in Northumberland to which Turner returned repeatedly, painting it with a different medium and different style and indeed different configuration each time. Now, most of you will not have seen Dunstanburgh Castle on the coast of Northumberland. So what I'd like to try to do is enable you to see it in full color. Here is a black and white image of it, but I apologize to those of you who've seen it before, this sort of demonstration before, but I hope you'll still enjoy doing it once more. If you stare at the black dot, just for about 15 seconds, continue staring at the black dot for 15 seconds. Just keep staring at the black dot. Keep staring at the black dot. I'll now replace that pseudo-color image with a black and white image of Dunstanburgh Castle, and you should see a full color image of the castle. With the combined effect, did it work for Andrew? Yeah. Combined effects of chromatic adaptation in the retina and beyond, and your memory colors for sky, grass, water, and gorse. In Turner's own memory, Dunstanburgh Castle completely transmogrified. He even moved the coastline and the sea in his later painting and his earlier painting of it in an oil. So how do we measure color constancy in the lab, and how did we measure it in the National Gallery show? Well, typical measurements of color constancy fall into several categories. The first being surface color matching, in which people match the color of a surface to be under one light to match its appearance under another light. Another method for measuring color constancy is actually to measure the estimate that the observer has in their head of the illumination color, for example, by achromatic adjustment. Another method is object color naming. Does the person's name for a particular object color stay the same under changes in illumination? And perhaps more real-world test of color constancy is object selection. Does the observer perceive the object to have stayed the same? Would they pick the same object under a new illumination? So measuring color constancy by matching, in which the observer reports the percept they see for an object under two different illuminations, and then the similarity of those two matches is compared to get an index of how good that color constancy is a standard method for measuring color constancy, which, as Professor Gegenfertner summarized yesterday so nicely, has yielded estimates of color constancy which are largely not that great. Measures of constancy with this technique have ranged from 10% to 85%, whatever the stimuli are used to make the matches. And typically, these stimuli use a very limited number of illuminations, comparing the scene from one illumination to singly one other illumination. So in the National Gallery, what we wanted to do was to use a couple of different techniques to measure color constancy in this large population which was coming through the show, to get something like a real-world estimate of color constancy. And the elements of the setup, as I mentioned, were two paintings at the front of the cinema of the same painting, but one was an actual painting with pigments and the other was a print of that same painting. They were illuminated by a set of luminaires, each one of which was a tunable multi-channel LED, so multi-LED channel light source. Each LED channel in the light source emits light in a small region of the spectrum, and its output in each channel can be scaled in real time by a computer to produce a spectrum of almost any desired type. The painting that we used was a copy of Gauguin's bowl of fruit and tankard before a window, painted with pigments that were mixed specifically to match common impressionist pigments used, like those used by Gauguin. People in the audience had clickers, so they could give their responses to questions that were asked in the film or as the lights changed on the painting. And these clickers were integrated with the video display and with the lights so that all of the changes were synchronized, and we could record the responses and then analyze them. And this was programmed by, I should say, by Brad Pierce, this system. So I just want to talk about a couple of the experiments that we did to measure color constancy. One of them was color constancy by illumination discrimination, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I want to say as well that throughout the set of experiments and demonstrations, we asked people questions about themselves, so we could do a bit of demographics, so we compare different age groups, males versus females, for example. And we also asked them questions about their responses to the show in general. And we had about 10,000 people come through, and 1,800 of them answered all the questions, so we could have a complete set of data from them. So I just want to talk about the method of measuring color constancy by illumination discrimination, but I want to compare it with the method of estimating the illumination spectrum through achromatic adjustment. In this task, a person would adjust a small patch in the scene to appear white, and the light reflected from a surface that appears white to the person therefore gives us an estimate of what they think the illumination spectrum is. And typically, measurements of people's estimate of the illumination spectrum tend to fall along the blue side of the daylight locus. So this is quite a sort of key point, which has also been mentioned several times in this conference, that people tend to see whites as being slightly bluish, or they tend to see sort of desaturated blues as white. So matches tend to fall on the blue side of the daylight locus. There's a blue bias in individual estimations of illumination. And in color constancy work, the point that a person chooses as their white point, their achromatic adjustment point, is taken to be the chromaticity of the equivalent illumination that they have in their head. And from this point, then, the way surfaces appear to them can be estimated. So the equivalent illumination assumption rests on the fact that the chromaticity that the person sets the white point to be uniquely specifies the illumination spectrum. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So, but we say instead of this indirect method of measuring illumination chromaticity, we ask whether we can measure sensitivity to temporal changes in illumination through the global illumination discrimination task. And specifically, are there some illumination changes to which we are insensitive? And does that then tell us something about human color constancy and the way the brain has evolved to in its sensitivity to illumination changes? Specifically, color constancy may be best for those illuminations under which we evolved, illuminations that vary from the blue to the yellow along the daylight chromaticity locus. And again, artists have been very aware of this spectrum of daylight colors. For example, Monet, again, captures the variation in light from blues to yellows. And he also captures the fact that shadows tend to be blue, an observation that Mike Webster has also made. Renoir instructed other painters to never use real white, that white is in fact a surface that reflects the light shining on it. So when you're painting snow, you must show blue from the sky, green and yellow from the sky, and in the evening, red and yellow in the snow. Turner, of course, was the master at painting daylight, and here he captures the daylight chromaticity locus on paper in his color beginning. Turner had this very interesting color theory that yellow functioned as a light and reds and blues functioned as a dark. So he wasn't actually thinking of yellows and blues as opponent. But here you see again his use of these opponent colors. And just a note, since I said blue and yellow, of course it's in perceptual color space, it's not really an opposition between blue and yellow, as again we've heard repeatedly in this conference and elsewhere, but blue is really more in opposition to orange in our physiological representation of color space. And I just want to say that might be one reason why Van Gogh's Two Crabs is so effective, because he has a perfect opposition of blue and orange here. But to go back to our measurements of color constancy. So our basic observation is that as the light changes smoothly from blue to yellow along the daylight axis, we're largely unaware of that change in illumination spectrum. So the light is changing on this so-called Mondrian papered box slowly from blue to yellow, and yet I reckon it's only about now that you start to see the yellow change of the light on the box, because we're particularly insensitive to changes in the bluish end of the spectrum. The box has changed from this blue to this yellow, and yet we're not so aware of that change. So we've taken this idea and turned it into an illumination discrimination task, asking people whether they can perceive changes in illumination on a fixed scene that are parametrized along that daylight locus, and then comparing their responses to changes on an orthogonal axis. And in the task, people see a scene, then there's a blank, and they see a potentially matching scene, and then a second potentially matching scene, and they're asked which of the two scenes matches best. So a single trial goes something like this. Reference scene, first possible, second possible. Did the first or second comparison best match the target? Second. Very good. That was an easy one, where the distances between the two lights for the second one was very great. And in the laboratory, we test 50 steps along each half axis, comparing lights along the blue-yellow Planckian locus with lights along an orthogonal red-green axis. And in one version of the task, we find, we do a method of constants method, which is just a method of looking for accuracy in discrimination, and we find that people are much worse at detecting changes in the illumination along the bluish direction, and they're slightly better if they're doing it for a gray box than for a Mondrian box. But this asymmetry holds that they're worst in the bluish direction. So we can say that people have better color constancy for bluish illuminations. So changes in the bluish direction, they're less sensitive to, so they have better color constancy. And this result has held up in many different laboratory versions of the task, including simulated scenes and real scenes. The simulated scenes work was done at University of Pennsylvania by David Brainard's lab. And the asymmetry in the thresholds, this being higher thresholds mean poorer discrimination, you need a bigger change in order to see the difference, holds across both sets of observers on both sides of the Atlantic, whether the scene is simulated or real. People are worse at seeing changes in the bluish direction. So we say this is a blue bias. Again, another way in which blue is special. We're less sensitive to changes in object color as the illumination changes in the blue direction. And as Stacey Aston has recently shown, this blue bias holds even when you start from a different adapting point of illumination. And these individual differences in blue thresholds are not explained by differences in basic chromatic discrimination ability. I'll just go through this, skip over these quite quickly. But what the National Gallery experiment enabled us to do with such a large population was to look at other types of individual variations. And we could just ask, does this basic result hold in a semi-natural viewing condition when people are viewing paintings on the wall, as here? So in this public venue, in this public exhibition, we did the same experiment, asking people to view the paintings under one light. We then turned off the lights and showed them two sample lights and asked them which light best matched the first. And for different groups of people, we used different steps in illumination. So any one group got only one step, but we were able to average over all people and find that indeed this result of people being worse, in this case this is accuracy now on this axis, being worse for blue illumination changes held in a larger population. So illumination change discrimination is again worse for bluer illuminations, and this is for the 10,000 people who did this experiment, which means that color constancy is better for blue illuminations. If we look just at the group of people who answered all of the questions, we know whether they were male or female and how old they were. We can dig down a little bit into the differences between individuals. And here we find that there is a big difference in age. So people who are older than 25 are significantly worse in detecting bluer illumination changes than younger people. What this might suggest is that, in fact, color constancy is better with age. People are less sensitive to illumination change as they get older. It's an interesting interpretation of it. So the conclusion of that experiment is that color constancy seems to be optimized for daylight illuminations. In particular, we have a blue bias for seeing illuminations. And this asymmetry in illumination discrimination holds across different contexts and different methods. But color constancy is not so good for other types of illumination changes. We have, especially with novel illuminations, the problem of color inconstancy. And I'll just let Brad Pierce demonstrate that here.
These walls, you can pretty much tell what color this one red and this one's blue. This one, however, looks quite brown. Now, if we change the illumination, we'll see that this one turns green. These still remain the same color.
So that was a relatively simple change in the light spectrum from the tuned LED lamps, which didn't make such an apparent change in the color of the wall. But these failures of color constancy are in fact not restricted to artificial situations in the laboratory. We do see them in the natural world. You see a very radical change, for example, in the color of Ayers Rock in Central Australia over a space of 5 minutes as the sun set. The color of the rock appears to change radically. It is known for its dramatic changes in color, and that's one of the things that gives it its magical properties in the people of Uluru. Metameric lights give us a particular form of color inconstancy. Here I have the Mondrian box illuminated under two different metameric lights. Under a metameric light, a neutral surface appears the same, but chromatic surfaces appear different. Definition of a metamer is that it elicits the same excitations from the cone receptors despite having a different spectrum. And here, the two boxes are illuminated by two different metamers, each of which is metameric to daylight of D65. So a lighting scientist would say these lights are all the same color because they have the same color temperature. They elicit exactly the same color appearance from a white surface. And yet we can see what effect they have when shown in alternation on this Mondrian box. You get, in this slow alternation, a sense of the actual surfaces in the box changing color. So the use of metameric lights can tell us something about our sensitivity to temporal changes in color and whether we attribute them to surfaces or illumination change. So when we do the alternation very fast between these two lights, and these are real lights shining on real papers, you instead get the impression of an illumination flicker instead of a surface color change. Now, because the two lights are metameric, the white paper towel roll remains fairly constant in color, but there's a very strong effect on skin. And if you look closely at the hand bringing in the white paper towel, you see it changes from a sort of healthy red to a very sickly green under these metameric lights, although the white paper towel remains exactly the same color. So metameric lights can have failures of color constancy, but you can sort of turn it on its head and say we can use metameric lights in museums, for example, to improve the colors of objects, as Françoise Viennot has done. And she's taken historic specimens whose colors have faded and used carefully tuned metameric lights to restore their color, this being one of, I think, Darwin's finches, faded here, and here with its color restored by a carefully chosen metameric light. So color constancy breaks down under metameric illumination changes, and this renders completely invalid the notion that you can use achromatic adjustment to estimate the person's illumination spectrum. So that's just a sort of theoretical but important point that I want to make. And yet, there are illumination changes for which surface appearance remains constant, within which our color constancy is perfect, and these are for bluish illumination changes along the daylight locus. So lastly, I want to just talk about color constancy by naming, which was another way to probe color constancy, which we tried out in the National Gallery. So we asked people what color the central object was here and gave them 4 choices. And then we shone the painting, we shone different lights on the painting, and under each condition asked them what color they perceived, what this object to be, by giving it a color name. So color constancy would require that name to stay the same under different illuminations. And we all know that there are huge individual differences in color naming, both in the use of basic color terms and in the use of more florid named colors. And this is just a depiction of the color category space of a single normal trichromatic subject using a method of convex hulls that we use to describe the naming spaces of individuals. And here you can see the variety of different color categories between 3 normal trichromatic observers. The space to which they apply a given color term, the volume to which they apply a given color term varies widely from person to person. And we're very aware of these individual differences in color naming, especially because of this phenomenon, and no talk about color is complete, even though we're all sick of it, without mentioning that dress or that. So I think she really, she has the last word on it, I think. But in this same program, we set up a tent to measure people's perception of the real dress. And she also has the last word. Okay, I just think you all need to know that that is the way the world views us vision scientists. We've been vindicated. But I like to think that before the dress, we showed the same phenomenon. In this experiment in the National Gallery, we had people name the fruit, and lo and behold, people looked at the same painting under one illumination and they gave the fruit different names. The difference in names was between orange and yellow. Here you see, under this slide, 78% of the participants name the fruit as yellow, and the 22% name it as orange. So that's a big variation in color names. It might not feel as big as the difference between blue and white, but it's a big difference. Under another light, people switched their name of the fruit to orange. So 81% name it orange under this light, whereas 78% named it yellow under the other light. This is what you would call poor color constancy. And the rest of the painting looks pretty much the same, and these are metameric lights, so the background looks white. So in that experiment, we've changed people's perception from an orange to yellow. And in the actual exhibition, we put orange and yellow in the same room, illustrating that they are quite close to each other, but they still are in fundamentally different categories. Now, because we asked people all these questions, we could determine whether or not we had any people with potential color vision deficiency in the group by simply asking them the question, do these two paintings look the same? And for those people who said yes, we made an assumption that their color vision was not a normal trichromatic. In a subgroup, about 3.5% of males said yes, these two paintings look the same. And if we look at their answers on the color naming test of color constancy, we find that under the first light, 40% named the fruit as yellow and 55% named the fruit as orange. But under the second light, 71% name it as orange and 7% as yellow. So more of them retain the same color name for the fruit than in the normal trichromatic group. So you could say they have greater color constancy. So we also asked them which color they liked best for the painting. So this is a sort of direct question of which color they preferred to see the painting illuminated by. And in this case, the overwhelming answer for the group as a whole, here we had 6,000 people, was daylight, a bluer light than the candlelight or tungsten light that we simulated. And some people had a strong preference as well for cool white fluorescent. Again, we could do a comparison across ages, and what we find, though, is that this difference between daylight and cool white fluorescent goes away in the younger population. So the younger people are losing their preference for daylight as they're exposed to more artificial light, although they share a preference for bluer light together with the older people. So just to summarize this, all of this, summary is that we do have perfect color constancy, perfect appearance constancy for some illumination changes. There's no change in surface color for changes in illumination along the bluish end of the daylight locus. And so we can say that color constancy is best for those daylight illuminations under which we evolved. And this blue bias is robust in a variety of measurements, both in the laboratory and outside of the laboratory. And I haven't gone into other studies, but in other studies it suggests that this blue variations in this blue bias might explain variations in color constancy, like the variations in naming of the dress, which we see. And this preference for bluish lighting is reflected in the deployment of some artists' favorite colors. But I just leave us with the thought that because we can actually engineer dramatic changes in object color, which change people's perception of objects and their name they give to objects using infinitely tunable light spectra, the failures of color constancy that I've shown will become more commonplace, and we could ask the question as to whether color will remain a reliable signal in tomorrow's world. Thank you. point of doing the experiments in the National Gallery was to probe color constancy with a specific set of stimuli in a large population to demonstrate that these kind of experiments can be done in mass venues and yield the same results in the laboratory. So it's a cross-validation from laboratory to real-world viewing. The point of the illumination preference experiments is not to say this is the best illumination for all paintings. It's a very specific question as to which illumination is preferred for viewing this particular painting. And in some ways, it's a surprise that people didn't prefer the warmer illumination, which better brought out the fruit colors. They preferred the illumination, which actually was more like the colors of Brittany in which Gauguin painted this painting. So that's an interesting finding in itself. I totally agree with you that the optimal illumination for a particular painting will vary with the painting, the physical context of the room, potentially with the artist's intention. So I think I can see a future in which each painting in a museum will have its own targeted illumination. That's conceivable. But you can ask separate questions about why a particular person prefers a particular illumination in a painting. Is it because it makes the color gamut broader? Is it because it makes it more natural? Is it because it lends a particular atmosphere to the painting, more like the atmosphere created in a church in which the person would have viewed it originally, although the painter didn't paint it there, he painted it in front of a window, but he meant it to be displayed in a church. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can answer. I'm not saying I was trying to answer all of those questions. Everything of what you said except which artist it was. It's an artist who preferred his paintings to be exhibited from October to April, but not from April to October, correct? But I missed which artist? Turner. Well, I can tell you that neither the National Gallery nor the Tate, which has the massive collection of Turner that he bequeathed to the nation, observe this rule. They're on display all year round. And in the Clore Gallery in the Tate, Britain, they're under artificial illumination. So the seasons outside make no difference to the way they were displayed. But yes, I mean, he was, preeminently amongst all paintings, really consumed by this awareness of changes in the light spectrum. And so he probably did want them to be viewed in particular illuminations because of that interaction of light with the color that a person perceived in them. But we unfortunately don't follow that. Thank you.